Bluegrass Airport sits just beyond the rolling fences of Lexington's horse country, a modest terminal tucked amid pastures and barns. For most travelers, it's a waypoint, a place you'd struggle to mark on a map if you weren't from Kentucky. Yet at 6 a.m. on August 27, 2006, its runways glowed like any other airport in America, promising an ordinary morning of departures. This is the kind of place where routines run the show. The night gives way slowly, and the first hint of dawn makes the tarmac a charcoal sketch, edges softened, colors muted. Ground crews in reflective vests steam their breath in the cool air. Inside the terminal, coffee machines hiss as the first passengers gather. Business travelers outbound to connections, a honeymoon couple whispering plans, a grandmother with a paperback and a ticket to see her son in Atlanta. At Gate 1, Comair Flight 5191, operating as Delta Connection, boarded a Bombardier CRJ-100. Its cabin felt intimate, 2 seats on each side, racks already tugging at carry-ons. Up front, a 2-person crew prepared the aircraft. They ran checklists with that clipped clarity pilots train into their voices. The words are plain, the meaning is everything. Outside, twilight held fast. The airport itself had recently undergone changes to taxi routes and signage as construction reshaped the airfield's contours. To a stranger, the pavement all looks the same. To a pilot, the subtle language of lights and paint is the difference between routine and catastrophe. The tower frequency sounded calm, a single controller pre-dawn, handling clearances and movements. At small fields at that hour, it's not unusual, just a quieter cadence, punctuated by redbacks and acknowledgements. The plan was simple: push from the gate, taxi out, line up on the departure runway, and fly southbound for an early morning connection in Atlanta. Flight time? A short hop. This kind of morning trip is supposed to be ordinary, a bridge to somewhere else. But the mix of darkness, fatigue, construction detours, and human habit converges like an optical illusion. What looks obvious in daylight can become a trick of angles before sunrise. A taxiway jog, an unexpected turn, a familiar mental picture laid over unfamiliar signs, each harmless on its own, but together capable of bending perception. Passengers buckled in, tugging jackets, thinking about meetings or mid-morning breakfasts. No one imagined the runway ahead was not the one cleared, and that the aircraft they trusted would be racing into a box canyon of asphalt. The airplane's auxiliary power unit purred as the cabin lights dimmed for engine start. Safety briefing. Seatbelts clicked. A toddler's shoe tapped a seatback rhythm. Flight 5191 was, to nearly every soul on board, just a means to a morning. They didn't know this airport by name. They would never forget it afterward, if they could. The cockpit of a regional jet before dawn is a place of ritual. Switches sweep from off to on, annunciators blink, and lists call for responses. Challenge, verify, respond. The captain and first officer, each with thousands of hours in the air, settled into their roles. You don't fly professionally without revering checklists, but you're also human. You form grooves, shortcuts of attention you trust because they've never failed you until the moment they do. The clearance came. Runway 22 cleared for takeoff. It arrived in the tidy poetry of ATC cadence, read back, acknowledged. The heading for runway 22, the performance calculations, the speeds, they existed as numbers arranged neatly in minds and instrument bugs. But the airport outside had changed. Taxiways had been altered, signage rearranged, and in the pre-dawn darkness, landmarks that cue a pilot's internal map were either muted or misleading. Some runway lights were not what muscle memory expected to see. One controller watched it all, one voice juggling tasks in the tower, as is common before first light at a small field. Pilots cross-check everything: compass, runway markings, lighting, the sense of space. But even a well-trained mind can slip into confirmation bias, especially when the picture outside seems to match the expectation inside. The nose wheel turned, following pavement that felt right, aligning with a strip of runway that seemed exactly where it should be. The runway number at the threshold is supposed to shout its identity. In this darkness, it murmured. The first officer, scanning, voiced the runway by habit. Runway 22, but habit is perilous when it substitutes for seeing. The cockpit exchange that followed, routine, unremarkable, masked the most consequential misunderstanding of their careers. There's an idea in aviation safety called the chain of events. Rarely does a single mistake cause a catastrophe. Instead, a sequence of small, survivable deviations align. Fatigue, darkness, changed taxi routes, a momentary slip in sterile cockpit discipline, a controller attending to another duty, the absence of a final visual confirmation of runway heading, each link forged silently. In training, pilots break the chain by speaking up when something feels off, but nothing felt off enough. The human brain loves coherence. It tries to make the outside world match the inside map. That's what makes illusions so powerful. At the end of the runway ahead, it was not runway 22. The asphalt did not stretch as long as assumed. The correct runway was more than 7,000 feet, a generous path to lift and climb. The strip they faced was far shorter, tucked at a different angle, a dead end masquerading as the expected route. Neither man intended anything but a safe flight. Both trusted the rituals that had delivered them to Atlanta dozens of times. The aircraft sat ready, engines steady, lights bright against the black of morning. The cabin, unaware, rested in that hush between announcements and acceleration. We romanticize pilots as superhuman, but they are proofed in systems precisely because they are human. Systems catch what the eye misses, unless the human thinks the system has already confirmed it. Redundancy becomes theater when the cues are accepted rather than interrogated. In the next minutes, throttles would advance, and numbers on the airspeed tape would walk upward. The airplane, obedient, would answer. Physics has no patience for illusions. The taxi from gate to runway felt normal. Nose wheel lights through a cone that licked along painted center lines. The crew briefed the departure, verified speeds, confirmed the after-takeoff plan. Outside, the field's geometry, recently reworked, presented a puzzle. A jog here, a detour there, signage whose logic had changed incrementally but meaningfully. The difference between this way and that way was a decision measured not in miles, but in degrees. At complex airports, pilots are vigilant for runway incursions. At small airports before dawn, the mind can relax into a looser scanning rhythm, especially when traffic is light and the radio is quiet. The taxi diagrams in the charts are crisp, but the real world is a watercolor in the half-light. What used to be a right turn now looks like a straight-ahead continuation. The wrong runway, shorter, at a slightly different orientation, sat where the correct one seemed like it should be. They paused at the hold short line, performed the last checks, and eased forward to line up. The painted numbers near the threshold marked a runway that did not match their clearance. Yet the visual discrepancy didn't ring loud enough. There is a known hazard in aviation called expectation bias. If you believe you're on runway 22, your mind finds the cues that support it and filters out the ones that don't. The heading bug on the primary flight display is a sober friend, but even friends get ignored when you're certain. If the heading didn't match perfectly, maybe the brain rationalized it as a minor variation. The big runway's length, its yawning stretch of asphalt, did not lie ahead. A shorter path waited, shadowed and unforgiving. The tower's single controller had duties multiplied by solitude. Between scanning the runway environment and administrative tasks, the human eye can be drawn to the wrong pane of glass at precisely the wrong moment. In a cockpit, sterile rules keep out chatter. In a tower, the rule is vigilance, but humans are not cameras. The moment for a last visual check passed like a quiet car at an intersection, there and gone, before you register its shape. The cabin lights set to dim. A mother tucked a blanket tighter around her child. A consultant rechecked a slide deck for a 9 a.m. meeting. A track athlete scrolled through a playlist called Takeoff. The flight attendant made the final walk and scan, pointing out latches and seat backs, and settled into the jump seat. On the flight deck, the rhythm quickened. Strobes on, landing lights on, transponder set to Tay-Ray. The aircraft was aligned, just not where anyone thought. It is frighteningly easy to get lost on an airport surface that has been altered, especially in the in-between of night and day. If you could freeze that moment and walk the cockpit like a museum, the clues would be everywhere. The runway number under the nose, the magnetic heading, the angle of pavement relative to the lights of the terminal. But time doesn't stop for forensic tours. Airplanes live in motion, and the next step was inertia's favorite move: forward. Takeoff is choreography. Throttles forward, engines stabilize, thrust set. The airplane speaks in numbers: 80 knots, V1, rotate, and pilots answer with hands and eyes. On a properly long runway, the numbers arrive with room to spare, like stepping stones in a broad river. On a short runway, they rush toward you, demanding performance the airplane cannot give. The CRJ accelerated, obedient and fierce, but physics is indifferent to intention. The ground speed rose, the airspeed tape climbed, and the runway end crept closer, far faster than the captain's inner map allowed. Something felt off, perhaps only as a whisper. The runway lights ended too soon. The blackness beyond looked closer than it should. V1, the decision speed where a rejected takeoff becomes more dangerous than continuing, was calculated for a runway they were not on. Here, that number was a mirage. The correct math belonged to the correct strip of pavement, and the airplane was sprinting toward the edge of a map it did not know. The captain pulled for rotation, asking the jet to lift. The wings tried to bite the air, but airspeed and runway length made enemies of lift. The nose came up, tires rattled over the last paint, the mains brushed or briefly left the ground, the details blur in survivors' recounting and instrumentation traces. But the outcome was the same. No true climb, only a desperate skid into the darkness beyond the pavement. What happens next is a painter's study in momentum. The aircraft overran, struck a berm and trees. The cabin's quiet was shattered by a violent shudder as the structure absorbed forces it was never meant to meet at that angle. Seats tore loose. Overhead, bins coughed luggage. Oxygen masks trembled from their housings without deploying. The world turned sideways and then stopped in a new shape. Fire, fed by fuel, found ignition points in crushed metal. The mind, in shock, shrinks to one imperative: get out. In every accident sequence, there is a final, microscopic chance to break the chain. A recognition call-out, a last-minute reject, a controller's shout, a glance at the heading that sparks a challenge. It is not a moral failure when such chances are missed. It is the human condition under strain. And once momentum carries you past that point, the airplane becomes a physics problem that ends at a tree line. The tower's frequency, moments earlier placid, went white-hot. Emergency calls echoed. In the darkness beyond the wrong runway, an orange pulse rose. Sirens woke from sleep. Bluegrass Airport, quiet, modest, the airport you might never have heard of, became, for a few impossible minutes, the center of the aviation world. Airport fire crews train endlessly for this nightmare. In Lexington that morning, their turn came. Crash tenders roared toward the glow, tires hammering uneven ground beyond the runway end. The fire was intense but patchy. Angles of airframe that had folded in such a way that metal sheltered pockets of survivable space. First responders learned to listen for voices, for movement, for anything that tells them where to concentrate seconds that matter. They found chaos, torn fuselage, trees splintered, an acrid mix of fuel and earth. In the early count, the news was crushing. So many still, so few moving. But then, a human rhythm rose in a place it had no right to be. A pulse, a voice, a breath. The first officer had survived the forces that killed almost everyone else. He was catastrophically injured, yet alive, wedged in the cockpit wreckage. Rescuers stabilized him, forming a human chain of purpose. In the cabin area, there were no other survivors to call for. The numbers would later harden into a stark ledger: 49 lives lost, 1 life saved. In disaster, time stretches weirdly. Minutes feel like hours. Hours dissolve into a blur of lights and uniforms. The survivors are not only those on the aircraft, they include the firefighter who pulls a body and can still go home and hold his child, the paramedic who will remember the smell of that morning forever, the dispatcher who has to keep speaking calmly. Their testimonies years later still shake with the memory of headlights veining through smoke and the unsteady relief of finding a person who can blink at you. At the terminal, the story unfolded slowly for waiting families. Phones rang to voicemail. Airline agents assembled in corners to receive instructions they dread. In living rooms across Lexington and beyond, televisions interrupted morning shows. A small airport became a headline. Reporters mispronounced names and then corrected themselves. The language of aviation grief is now painfully familiar. Our thoughts and prayers, but underneath are real faces, calendars that would never flip to the next birthdays and anniversaries, marked lightly in pencil. The miracle of a single survivor is not a neat ending. It's a spark in a broken room that throws light on everything else. Why him and not the others? Why this seat and not that one? The body's margins for survival are measured in inches and newtons. The first officer would carry not only injuries, but a lifetime of questions that the human heart, unlike investigators, can never close. Outside Kentucky, Bluegrass Airport exists as a code on a boarding pass. Inside dozens of homes on that August morning, it became a gap where a loved one should have walked in at dinner. The family's stories braid together differently, but share the same anchor, a day that split time into before and after. In Lexington, a husband loaded a car seat, planning to surprise his wife returning that afternoon. In Cincinnati, a mother halfway through a second cup of coffee glanced at a crawler on the TV and felt her stomach go cold. In Atlanta, a brother checked arrival times and wondered why the inbound wasn't updating. The airline's phone tree lit up, pushing scripted empathy into chaotic minutes. The hardest reality comes not in one blow, but in a series of nudges. A call to come to the airport, a request to wait in a room, a uniformed person entering with a folder. Words like accident, fire, and no survivors take on the viscosity of oil, thickening the air. Families aren't data points, they are daily rituals now missing a piece. A daughter would never again hear her father tap the steering wheel in rhythm with old Motown. A fiancé would keep a wedding dress in a bag that felt heavier each month. A son would tape his father's football jersey to the wall above a bed and stare at it until it meant something other than pain. These details matter because they are how the departed stay real. In group rooms at the airport and later at hotels, families were briefed as information solidified. Some asked technical questions for which they had no vocabulary but absolute need. How could a plane take the wrong runway? Was anyone alive long enough to be afraid? Could it possibly be a mistake? The airline's care teams did what they could. Logistics, travel arrangements, grief counselors, a room where a minister and a therapist might sit side by side in the uncertain quiet. And then there is the long tale of grief, measured not in days, but in reconfigured lives. One parent kept calling her son's voicemail for months just to listen. A little boy asked his mother when the airplane would bring daddy back. A grandmother wrote the names in a spiral notebook, each neighbor, each casserole, with shaky gratitude. The human community responds to tragedy with food and presents because there is nothing else that reliably works. Meanwhile, the names of the lost began to appear in news articles and on church bulletins, forming a second kind of passenger manifest. the community that carried them. The National Transportation Safety Board arrived fast, as it always does, to freeze the moment and then thaw it carefully. Investigators walked the scar in the grass beyond the runway and laid out strings and flags to turn chaos into coordinates. They pulled transcripts and radar traces, tower logs, and cockpit checklists. The aim was not vengeance, but understanding, to draw a map of the invisible mistake so that others might never walk it again. In the harsh light of forensic work, facts accrete. The clearance had been for runway 22. The aircraft had lined up on runway 26, significantly shorter and at a different heading. Taxiway changes and construction contributed to a surface layout that could trick a mind primed with yesterday's diagram. The hour, pre-dawn, meant visual cues were muted, and runway lighting conditions did not deliver the unmistakable signature that daylight grants. In the tower, one controller handled duties alone, a normal staffing level for that hour, but one that leaves little margin for divided attention. Investigators recreated the taxi route and found that what seems absurd in hindsight, a professional crew turning onto the wrong runway, was a plausible outcome of compounded small factors. Human factors specialists sat beside pilots and airfield engineers to reconstruct a cognitive path, expectation bias, confirmation bias, fatigue, and the quiet power of routine. In CRM, crew resource management terms, the cockpit had lost the sharp edge of challenge and response at precisely the wrong time. The heading bug and runway signage were two reliable cross-checks, unheeded, perhaps registered, but rationalized away. The report would ultimately spread accountability across a system, as aviation reports do. The primary cause lay in the crew's failure to detect that they were on the wrong runway before takeoff. Contributing factors included the airport's layout and signage during construction, and the tower's inability to maintain a direct, unbroken line of sight vigilance during the critical phase. No one error was enough alone. That is what makes the story both maddening and useful. It tells the industry where holes line up. Every NTSB docket holds artifacts, transcripts with timestamps, photographs annotated with arrows, performance calculations showing how a jet that expects 7,000 feet will overrun a runway half that length. In these pages, the fear becomes math, and the math becomes a lesson plan for the next generation. The names in the report are not footnotes, they are the point. Investigators speak of them with a kind of professional reverence because the living owe the dead improvements, not just condolences. By the time the last cleaning cart rattled past Gate 12, the air had turned metallic, like rain that never quite fell. Every system in the building seemed to be half awake, monitors flickering between arrival boards and DOS grey diagnostics, a baggage belt sighing for a second, then stopping, then trying again. It was the uncomfortable lullaby of an airport that knows something's wrong, but can't say what. The timeline the investigators reconstructed is deceptively ordinary at first. 21:48, passengers begin pre-boarding. 22:02, the flight crew arrives at the jet bridge. 22:09, an orange-vested ramp lead authorizes ground power to the aircraft, while the APU stays idling in case of a brownout. Standard winter protocol, they wrote in a note that would later feel like a door left ajar. Minutes later, a maintenance supervisor on the terminal side runs a routine lighting test on taxiway C to clear an earlier NOTAM. None of these actions is unusual. Woven together, they become a snare. Inside the cabin, the temperature sits stubbornly at 61 degrees. A trickle of breath hovers in aisle lights like silk threads. The captain's voice through the PA is textbook calm. Small delay, folks, while we clear a shortcut around the de-icing queue. But a jet bridge sensor, the kind you never notice until it fails, keeps sending contradictory messages. Door closed, door ajar, door closed. The gate agent's monitor logs it as a flap. The jet bridge backs an inch, forward an inch, backs again. A shrug, a reset. Somewhere in the guts of the terminal, a PLC clocks that has fault chatter and writes a stack of warnings to a log no one is paid to read in real time. Then the whispers begin, not voices, more like coincidences that feign intention. The portable radio of a ramp dispatcher bleeds with a ghostly side tone, a faint duplicate of her own words returning half a second late, as if the concourse itself were trying to talk over her. She wraps the radio, swaps batteries, shrugs. On the flight deck, the FO toggles the avionics and hears a soft hiss in the overhead, static most likely, and notes, almost idly, that the taxiway edge lights beyond Gate 12 glow a shade too white, like someone peeled the blue film away. On a security camera pointed down an empty service hall, a motion-activated light flutters on with no motion at all. At 22:17, a power bump, too short to be a full outage, too long to be ignored, shudders through the pier. The ceiling signs dim to tea stain, the floor LEDs wake in a line like a runway marker, and no one outside, a duty electrician, feels it the way survivors later describe. A pulse that climbs the bones, ripples their teeth, and leaves behind a taste of hot pennies. A gate agent prints a fresh boarding manifest, and the printer gives her the list in a simpering, slow crawl, header repeated twice, as if reluctant to let the names leave the machine. In the NTSB transcript, this is the section shaded in yellow, the minutes where independent systems become co-conspirators. The lighting test on Taxiway C sends harmonics into a feeder that shares a utility closet with the Gate 12 jet bridge circuits. The jet bridge's confused sensor cycles its motor just as the ground power unit tries to sync phase with the aircraft. The phase lock relay hunts, slips, and a small square box the size of a lunch pail clicks in and out like a metronome. Passengers at the window see none of this. They see a nose cone, patient and blind, pointed toward a tarmac that looks like a breathing animal, steam rising from asphalt pores, de-icers scuttling like beetles. A boy palms a plastic plane and whispers facts to his grandmother. How many pounds of thrust, what the flaps do, where the black box rests. She smiles, not knowing the black box is already recording boredom and coughs and the captain's conversational weather report, unknowing that the recorder will become scripture. 22:25. The tower clears a regional jet on final and cracks a joke about the cold. The fire station at the far end of the field tests an engine with a blip, a cough, a puff of white that blows into the wind like a promise. A TSA supervisor signs off a shift change and walks the concourse with a cup of coffee too hot to hold. He stops at Gate 12 because the coffee sloshes. He watches his own reflection in the glass, and for a moment he swears the reflection lags, as if the glass were a slow screen. Later, he will tell investigators that detail and then wave it away. Sleep deprivation, nerves. The mind loves to install a haunting where there's only latency. What everyone remembers is the quiet before the almost. The captain calls for pushback. The tug is on the line. Hands go up, chocks out. That's when the jet bridge slips forward exactly 2 inches, and the system, doing its job at last, refuses the push. The screen at the gate flashes a red square. The bridge alarm barks, then dies mid-bark as the lights over the ticket desk fade to watercolor. Not black, not gone. Watercolor. The power has not failed, the electrician will say. It has decided to remember. There is a word the old rampers use for moments like this, when the night and the machines seem to conspire to slow everything without actually stopping it. They call it the drag. Tonight, the drag is a curtain, and somewhere behind it, the airport is whispering to itself in clicks and relays and fans, wait, wait, wait. The plane never does leave Gate 12. And before midnight, a chain of small decisions will turn that waiting into the kind of story people swear you're making up. Because who believes a flight can vanish from the future without ever leaving the ground? By the time investigators asked for the building's underbelly, the custodial shift had already coined its own superstition. Down there, they said, the air didn't smell recycled like the terminal above. It smelled older, like basements where the past settles in the corners. Behind Gate 12's carpet, beneath the food court fryer grease and winter salt, a network of crawl spaces, baggage belts and service halls stitched the pier together like arteries. And like arteries, they could clog. The first clue wasn't a footprint or a signature. It was an absence, a maintenance log that skipped a day no one thought to miss. A team had replaced a cabinet, a dead simple electrical panel that fed the jet bridge, a handful of outlets and half the signage on the pier, on a Tuesday that month. The log shows a neat block of initials, a part number for the panel, a lockout, tagout form stapled on top. The next day's inspection box, empty. In the margin, a felt-tip circle, like someone meant to come back to it and never did. If that single unchecked box had been the only problem, the story would have ended with a reprimand and a training module. But buildings are organisms, and the organism beneath Gate 12 had been learning bad habits for years. The baggage tunnel snaked past a standpipe that chirped when the heat kicked on. The sump pump room was a sea salt crust of previous winters. A dimple in the concrete led toward a floor drain that had never quite sat level and left a thin, stubborn mirror of water that reflected only ceiling pipes and the occasional spider. Those inches of water were enough to wick into a cable tray when the humidity swung. Metal remembers wet differently than people do. What they found beyond the locked grey door at the end of Corridor D felt like a time capsule. A retired storm shelter with laminated instructions from a decade-old tornado drill. A clipboard with a pencil anchored to it by string, a red mushroom emergency stop with a cracked plastic cover, and taped across the crack, a yellow note, "Do not use, cover replacement pending." The tape had browned at the edges. Pending, like all pending things, had calcified into permanence. Here's where the pieces start to interlock. The emergency stop, when properly guarded, should be unremarkable. Depress it, and the pier's non-critical circuits dump, release and reset, and they come back. But the protection for the stop's contacts had been swapped during that Tuesday panel replacement for an aftermarket cover that didn't sit flush. The cracked cover let moist air in. Moist air kissed a wire that, thanks to a contractor's shortcut months earlier, shared a conduit with the lighting test line for Taxiway C's edge lights. No, that isn't standard. Yes, it had been signed off during a rush retrofit after a microburst peeled half the roof like a lid the previous spring. The city needed the pier reopened in weeks, not months. Workarounds breed consequences. When the tower ran its late-night lighting test and the jet bridge sensor argued with itself, and the ground power unit tried to hold a phase, it wasn't one problem. It was three minor ones agreeing to meet under the terminal and shake hands through a perspiring wire. The handshake wasn't powerful enough to kill anything. It was just strong enough to make the pier flicker into indecision, just strong enough to make a dozen devices ask the same question at the same time. Are we on or off? Devices like things simple. Schrödinger airports make them anxious. As the investigators traced the conduit, they found another thing. Not a ghost, not an apparition, a choice. At some point, someone had wedged a folded business card into the red mushroom e-stop's cracked cover to keep it from nuisance trips. The card was pulped into the shape of the crack, and the ink had bled into a bruise. The name had blurred, but the embossed phone number was still tactile, the kind of number a contractor prints by the thousand and hands to foreman. They called it. It rang into a void. Company dissolved. Number retired, address turned into a vape shop. Upstairs, families would later say they felt the moment when the building remembered the card. They felt it as a drift. The PA's consonants smudging, the smell of hot plastic in a place that should smell only like pretzels and jet fuel. A boy with the plastic plane asked his grandmother why the lights were breathing. She didn't have the words for impedance, for crosstalk, for what happens when old air makes a door talk to a runway light. She only had a hand to squeeze his, and a promise she intended to keep. "Soon," she said. Soon. The investigator in the hard hat and the jacket with reflective tape took a penknife and eased the business card free. He flicked the red stop cover. It rattled like a tooth. He wrote up the world's most obvious recommendation. Replace the cover, separate the conduits, re-educate the building about which nerves it's allowed to share. That might have fixed any future night. It couldn't fix the one that had already happened, because while they were mapping the arteries, another truth was congealing upstairs. The flight never left, not because one thing failed, but because the space between people's attention never quite overlapped, like two flashlights searching for a dropped ring and missing the place where it actually glints. The gate agent watched the manifest. The captain watched the relay. The electrician watched the panel. The tower watched the taxiway. The building, meanwhile, breathed through a crack with a business card for lungs. Down under the terminal, the air did feel older. It felt honest, too. Cinderblock doesn't pretend. Pipes don't lie. The corridor told the story in dust and rust and pencil marks. What had been rushed, what had held, what would next time be smarter. When the team climbed the stairs back into the bright, the hum above felt newly translated. The airport hadn't been haunted. It had been layered, each layer just misaligned enough to turn a simple pushback into a ghost of a departure. When the report finally came, the kind with an executive summary that fits on a screen and an appendix that weighs as much as a small pet, it didn't accuse a villain. It didn't need to. The findings spoke a language anyone who has ever hurried knows by heart. Contributing factors: deferred replacement of protective covers, improper conduit sharing during emergency retrofit, inadequate re-verification following panel swap, susceptibility to harmonics during off-peak lighting tests, training gaps in jet bridge sensor fault handling, procedural ambiguity around ground power, APU overlap. In the story that strangers later post about, these are footnotes. In the story people lived, they are the weather they had to walk through to get home. Home did happen. No one slept in that terminal forever. Buses were called, hotels eventually had spare keys. The captain, whose logbook still needed one more line for the night, walked the aisle and explained more than he had to, the way good captains do. A grandmother accepted a voucher with a sigh and the embarrassing relief of someone whose promises can survive another sunrise. A boy with a plastic plane learned that aviation, like all big human things, contains quiet miracles and quiet mistakes. He fell asleep in his mother's coat with a new, serious look he would keep into adulthood. In the weeks after, the airport took on the embarrassed energy of someone tidying up after hosting a party that got weird. Gate 12's number was repainted with a marginally different font. The storm shelter door received a new, smugly uncracked cover. The conduit was split, the lighting test wire rerouted, and a windowsill checklist blossomed into laminated gospel. The safety meeting slides had more photos than bullets. A small metal sign appeared in the maintenance hall. If it's pending, it's broken. Pending shrank from a habit into a confession. But institutional improvements, however necessary, live alongside the human narratives that never quite file themselves away. Weeks later, a luggage tag turned up in a seatback pocket for a seat that should have been in the air by then, and a handler turned it over like a coin from a country that never existed. Months later, a late-shift barista said the light over her kiosk still hiccuped at the same minute past the hour, and she now took that as her cue to refill napkins. A gate agent learned the names of regulars who had been there that night and said those names softer, with an extra syllable of care. Online, a meme tried to grow. People who weren't there renamed the place with grander words: cursed gate, haunted airport. As if what is humanly complex must be cosmically simple. The people who were there mostly didn't correct them. They knew the truth was less cinematic and more durable, a system only as safe as its smallest part, a night only as patient as its most hurried choice. When they spoke of it at all, they spoke in the present tense, which is how you talk about a scar. There was one detail that floated to the surface late, stubborn as a bubble refusing to pop. Security footage from well after the concourse had emptied, time-stamped 0241, shows the PA mic at the desk of Gate 12 flickering to life, a red LED winking as if tapped. No voice follows, only the terminal tone that precedes announcements, then silence. A maintenance man off-camera steps into the frame, taps the mic, and the light behaves. He shrugs, finishes a form, leaves. The system log calls it a false wake. If you want an ending with a shiver, you can borrow that moment and hold it up to the light. If you want an ending with a lesson, take the sign from the maintenance hall instead. We didn't know the people at Gate 12 before that night began. By morning, we carried pieces of them. The captain's patience, the grandmother's promise, the boy's plastic plane, now with a crack none of us intend to glue. The crew who stayed on until every stranger had a bus seat. The electrician who said it decided to remember and then built a checklist that made remembering a job, not a miracle. The union steward who insisted that pending meant broken and watched the sign appear. The field is safer because none of them insisted on a ghost to explain what human hands had already made and could unmake. The flight that never took off is not a hole in aviation's record, it's a seam. Press your fingers there, and you can feel how many threads hold. It is less about the horror of a night that tipped toward panic and more about the quiet heroism of everyone who refused to let panic be the only story. Airports are cities with one story to tell. Forward. Sometimes forward pauses. Sometimes forward looks down, sees a crack, and chooses to fix it. If you visit the pier now, the air doesn't feel older. It feels used, like a room where people work and try and sometimes fail. And then, if they are lucky and stubborn, learn. You won't find the business card. You won't likely find the exact shade of blue-white the lights wore that night, but you'll see the sign. You'll see a red cover that isn't cracked. You'll see a door that remembers how to be a door. And if you stand at the window where a boy once explained thrust to his grandmother, you might catch your reflection lagging in the glass. You'll tap the glass because you're human, and humans tap things that make them feel the world is glitching. Then you'll check the time and board another flight, and carry the seam with you the way you carry a spare battery. Not because you expect failure, but because you respect the possibility and know how to keep moving through it.